Just how frequently did these hold-ups happen before the decision to close the banks?
Well, this is not the first time it happens, of course, but the past week has seen about 9 of these, you call them holdups. Actually, these are not holdups because people are not stealing money. All they're doing is trying to get hold of their bank accounts, which obviously they are no longer able to do. And it's very interesting because the identities of these individuals vary from one to the other. One is an architect, the other is a police officer. So these are ordinary people that actually need to have access to these resources. The architect that I mentioned, Sally Hafiz, is a quite known individual in the civil society, and she wanted the money. She got about $13,000 to pay for her sister's cancer treatment in Turkey. So you can imagine the kind of need that exists out there. But of course, the banks are not responsive. They're not going to be responsive because they've been sitting on this problem for the past 3 years without even thinking about any kind of solution, hoping perhaps that the lethargy that exists amongst the population will continue sine die.
So what will happen now that the banks are closed? How are people supposed to access their money?
Well, this is a game that's being played now. We have to be clear about this between the banks and the government on the one hand. It's very important to ask what is it that the banks want at the end of the day. Just very briefly to recollect, the banks had approximately $175 billion 3 years ago in deposits, 70% of which were in US dollar accounts. Now, that's a lot of money for a country of 5 million people. And there are 65 banks in this country with about 1,000 branches throughout the place. And there were no problems before. But obviously, because of the crisis, the economic collapse that occurred, the government is no longer responsive to the banks in the way they were. So therefore, what are the banks really trying to get? What they want to do is very simple. They want the government to assume all of the responsibility or most of the responsibility for the failures, and they want the population to forego a good chunk of their savings. In other words, if you had $100 in the bank 3 years ago, today you only have $10, and we'll only give you those $10 over the next 5 years, one drop at a time. Obviously, this cannot go on, and the system is it's collapsed already. I was going to say it is collapsing, but it's not collapsing anymore. It really has collapsed.
Let's go back to these incidents where people are trying to take their money back by force. They've actually been drawing a lot of public support. People are on their side. But how is the legal system likely to react to cases like these?
Well, this is a very interesting question as well. The legal system itself is in crisis. It cannot get any kind of decision going. Let me give you some examples so that your viewers can really appreciate what has happened to the legal system in the country. A judge, an ordinary judge, had a salary going between $2,500 and approximately $6,500 per month before the collapse of the currency. Let's remember that the currency has lost about 95% of its value. Therefore, the same judge that was making between $2,500 and $6,500 per month today is only making between $125 and $270 per month. The question that needs to be asked is, how can a judge live on that kind of a salary? Which, by implication, means in order to supplement the resources, the judge will have to take bribes in judging certain cases in order to be able to make his ends meet. I mean, obviously, one cannot make any kind of living in this country unless one cheats the system. So therefore, the collapse of the legal system is full-fledged right now. And the best illustration of this is what happened after the August 2021 blow-up of the harbor, where 220 people were killed. And nothing has happened in the past 2 years. No judgment has been deferred. The lawyers in charge and the judges in charge are essentially postponing their decisions one after the other. Several people have been indicted and nothing has happened. This is just another manifestation of the crisis between the legal system and the banking system and the manufacturing system and the industrial system, all on the one hand, and government officials who are unresponsive, who are lethargic, who are not responsive to the needs of the population. This is not going to solve anything.
And let's look at the government for a moment. So Lebanon has been trying to form a government before President Michel Aoun's term is due to finish in a little over a month. Is that any closer to being realised? And even if it was realised, would it make a difference at this point?
This is an excellent question because it is full of hope that, in fact, a successor to the president could be elected. There are several candidates who have already presented themselves as salient to the system, but none of them really can do anything about the entire collapse of the country. The president of the republic is a symbol more than any other thing. Therefore, you have to have some kind of agreement among all the warring factions in this country. And I'm using those words intentionally, warring factions, because the mentalities have not changed since 1975, 1990. Except that the war is not on the ground, it is an economic war that's going on. Now, what can happen to change all of this? Well, several things, obviously. The most important one of which, in my humble opinion, is that outside governments, whether it's the United States, whether European governments, or Australia, a number of other countries, should not assume that this political class is capable of change. And the proof of this is that nothing has happened during the past 3 years. The IMF and the World Bank have been pleading for reforms. Not a single reform has been introduced. So therefore, this is a very important point. As long as outside powers continue to play the game, none of the reforms that are expected are going to happen here. And the second role is the expatriate Lebanese population that is spread all over the world. As I'm sure your viewers know, there are more Lebanese living outside of Lebanon than in it. And they are coming in during the summer period, bringing with them hard-earned money. And this past summer, for example, about 1 million expatriate Lebanese came. They brought with them between $3 and $4 billion, which is really a lot more what the economy is producing locally. So therefore, the expats have got to make a decision as well. They participated in the last parliamentary elections. The result was 13 independent members of parliament that were elected. 13 parliamentarians are not going to cut it among 128, because the president of the republic can only be elected when he has, in the second term, 65 votes, and those votes are not there. So therefore, the expats have a responsibility as well. They have to make a decision. What is it that they want from Lebanon? Do they want to continue the system the way it is? Or do they want to withdraw, essentially, and let the whole thing collapse until such time when hopefully either the country will split and everybody will live separately? And one last point, the third and most important item that needs to change in this country. People don't pay attention to these things, but we have to really think about what's happening next door in Syria. The smuggling that is going on between Lebanon and Syria has got to end. This has got to stop. The borders are porous, people going back and forth. This past week, of course, there is a crisis because cholera has started in Syria, and there is a fear that it will come from Aleppo to Lebanon. So we will see what happens. But the smuggling is ongoing. Unless that happens, unless that stops, then we're not going to see any kind of internal reforms. Why? Simply because the political establishment is benefiting financially, including the banks, financially benefiting from the smuggling that's going on. It's a very complicated situation.
Absolutely.
There is no solution on the horizon. We're bound to see this continue for a while.
As you say, it's a very complicated situation, but Joseph Kechichian, we really do appreciate you speaking to us about it. Thank you.
My pleasure.